Okay. There's only 6 of the original powder mill buildings that are still here. And of course there's this barn. And then as you go down Dust House Road, there's Daigle's welding shop office, which was just a small storage building actually at the time, but somehow it hung on. And then there's the blacksmith shop, which is really badly in need of touching up the bricks. It's kind of falling apart. And that's, when you go down to one more building is now Little John O'Connor's sign shop. And that was a keg shop for the powder company. But once the powder mills closed, and they didn't put up a fence around the place, 50 years later, there's almost nothing left of the wooden parts. It just rots away, but people came in and took all the usable materials. There was nobody stopping them, and bricks from the foundations, and those foundations are kind of hard to recognize today. The ground softened up and caved in a lot of the tunnels and everything. We're not supposed to explore over there. It's water company property, so we just go over there on Sundays.
Well, my father, as a boy, had polio. So he was bedridden for quite a while, and he lived next to the schoolhouse in Hazardville. And in 1913, one of the largest explosions in the powder mill took place. And my father recalls that he was laying in bed, and the windows were blown out of the house. He put his foot against the wall, and the wall was vibrating back and forth. And of course the school bell rang, and the children came running out. They didn't know whether one of their relatives was killed in a powder mill. So it was a very dramatic experience. In fact, that 1913 explosion was heard all the way up in Northampton, Mass. It was such a large explosion. Yeah.
Yes. Mr. Gordon, tell me what Hazardville was like on the 4th of July.
Oh, believe me, it was fantastic. We'd, all of us would be up at the firehouse, and first thing you know, we'd have bonfires all over town. And the people years ago, the people that used to work in the powder mills, they used to get the old powder and put it along the street. And believe me, we had quite a time back then. And we had, I would say, we'd stay up all night long, and for 2 nights, just putting out fires and stuff like that. And what they would do, the fellas would get these tires. We'd have a fire at one end of the town, and at the other end of town there'd be another fire. And then years ago, at the same time, there'd be another barn fire way down the other end of town by Charnley Road. And that's off of Skiddyco. But years ago, there was hardly any firemen around except what we had up at the firehouse, you know. And years ago, we had I would say there was about maybe 40 firemen. And it was hard back in them days trying to get people to because everybody was working. But I'll tell you, I had a lot of fun back in them days too. You know, yeah, they would lay it in the street and then take a match and just go like that, and you'd be like a sparkler, you know, just going down the street. No, it would just fizzle right out, you know. So, but back in them days, it was great. Today, you couldn't do anything like that today.
My great-great-grandmother had 3 brothers that were here in Hazardville. The first one to die was her brother George. He died about 3 months after she and my great-great-grandfather came over here from England. The Prickett brothers came over here to work in the powder mills at the request of Colonel Hazard. They worked originally at Paul's Mills in Faversham, England. Brother George died 3 months after his sister came over here. Brother William, the father of Edward Prickett, the superintendent, died later. Henry Prickett was injured in an explosion, but did not die. He went on to become a farmer. And that's the story of the Pricketts. Okay? Okay.
good to get that story.
Well, there aren't too many that are left here in Hazardville that are related to the Crickets. So they've moved, they're alive, but they're in other parts of the country. But the three brothers that, I think there was another brother, James, they're buried in the cemetery in the center of Hazardville along the Cedar Street side of the cemetery. And their mother's buried on the other side, but there's no stones.
When you're ready.
I grew up in Enfield, Connecticut, after the Hazard gunpowder mill was long gone, and Hazardville was just a part of town named after some guy that was supposedly named Hazard, who lived 100 years ago. The guy who owned that big house that burnt down in 1969. I was just a kid, and I never knew there was so much more to the story. My family has lived in Enfield for 5 generations, and my grandmother told me about her family's connection to the mill. Dr. Frank Taylor, my high school history teacher, always told frightening and compelling stories of the Hazard gunpowder mill when I was in high school. But it wasn't until 4 years ago when Enfield native Mrs. Alice Allen compiled her husband's in-depth writings on the Hazard gunpowder mill into a book that illustrated the incredible story of the workers' lives at the mill that I was moved to dig deeper. This is the story of the Hazard gunpowder mill and how it affected generations of people in Enfield. My grandmother is the reason I'm telling this story. My grandmother, Anna White, grew up in Hazardville. Her father, James White, worked at the mill, and she always told me stories about how dangerous the Hazard powder mill really was. In March of 1905, her father had to deliver powder to a mill in New York on the Hudson River, when suddenly that mill exploded, and my great-grandfather was killed. My grandmother was only 11 years old and one of 4 small children in her family. How my great-grandmother and her children survived is the heart of the bigger story I want to tell. There are many more explosive secrets of heartache and joy to reveal from the history of the Hazard gunpowder mill.